Welcome back, boils and ghouls. Tonight, we are joined by a very special guest. It is part of my ongoing quest to discover absolutely everything that there is to know about Sam Keith. But most importantly, we're going to be diving into some really interesting stuff that influenced me while I was growing up that falls kind of outside of the mainstream Marvel and DC work. Jeff Nicholson is the guy behind Ultra Klutz. You might have also seen his work in Taboo and several other places, but don't worry, we're going to be getting to all of that tonight. We're going to do a super deep dive, so let's get right on into it and talk to our special guest tonight, Jeff Nicholson. How you doing tonight, man?
Hello, I'm doing great. I'm really glad to be here. I'm out here in California and we're having some gorgeous spring weather, so it's all good.
Yeah, man, we're finally starting to get some good weather down where I'm at, so... So now, can you tell me a little bit how you just got into comics to begin with?
Sure. I'm one of those guys that says he can never remember when he didn't draw, but it's true. I've been drawing since I think pre-kindergarten. I don't even know it. It's just such a feral memory. But I started out with Mad Magazine was probably a big obsession, and this is going to date me, but I was really into trading cards that were like these odd rods, and they were like monsters with hot rods, and and wacky packages. So it's kind of like, for the newer generation, think of that as your Garbage Pail Kids, but this is from the early 70s, and that stuff was a big deal. Also car show t-shirt art, and some of that, it turns out, was done by underground cartoonists like Robert Williams and John Pound. So it was really cool stuff, caught my eye early on, and that was what influenced me, I think, to draw weird stuff. Didn't get into DC Comics until around fifth grade or so, and that was in the early 70s. So there was, Jack Kirby was still doing his Commandy, and Bernie Wrightson was still doing Swamp Thing. So those were some cool times for DC. So I think that shaped me artistically. And then also in fifth grade, which was 1973 in the Klutz history timescale, is when I did the first Ultra Klutz strip. And it's probably no surprise it started as a juvenile thing with a name like Ultra Klutz, but that's where it started. And they were just like strips. Ultraman was one of my favorite shows, but really I loved the monsters. I didn't really like Ultraman that much. So I wanted an Ultraman that got his ass kicked by the monsters. And that was the genesis of it. And as it turns out, I think it was subconscious at the time, but actually making him Ultra Klutz and lose his battles made him more of a sympathetic character. So that kind of gave it some legs to have more of a life than just a two-dimensional thing down the road. So like you said, probably like Don Chen and probably most comic book artists, I hand drew full issues in junior high, hand colored them, taped them, stapled them, mocked them all up, 8.5 by 11 binder paper, facsimiles. I did 6 issues of Ultra Klutz from 1975 to 1980, like that. So that is kind of sums up the juvenile period. And if you don't have any questions, then I will transition that to the next step, which is the underground Ultra Klutz from 1981.
The one question I would have is, what did you do with that stuff in high school? Was that mostly just for your friends, like to show off and get practice and stuff?
My friends and family was always very supportive, and they would just read them over my shoulder. I was so proud. I would sit there and almost narrate them and turn the pages, and my friends loved them. And, this is the 70s stoner times. And so, my friends would just love to get loaded and just read these ridiculous comics. So yeah, they were just for, well, one story that I guess does relate to the self-publisher bug, or it being in my blood perhaps, is in 7th grade, the very first Ultra Klutz mock-up. I was not a popular kid in school by any stretch, but because of that comic book, I walked around campus with it and a clipboard, and I got kids to sign up to buy a copy if I printed it. And I got 50 kids to sign up that they would pay 50 cents And actually, the price box on my mock-up comic said 50 cents a doob or 1-pack Marlboro. For those of you who are too young, a doob was a joint, and they actually were only about 50 cents at the time. Pack of cigarettes was about 50 cents at the time. So 50 cents doob or 1-pack Marlboro for Ultra Clutch #1. My mom had a printer at work, and I thought I could print these and sell them. And later I realized it was an ancient black and white photocopier. Wasn't going to print in color anything, but that was my very first dipping my toes into self-publishing.
And all of that black and white stuff, like, do you have any of that left? I read on your website that a lot of that stuff was lost somehow.
They were lost by me. I don't want to get too far ahead, but a lot of stuff did not survive one of my I'm quitting comics forever.
Oh, okay.
Hits, and they all got thrown away. It's one of the stupidest things I've ever done. But all those proto comics, and they're actually all in full color. They're all hand colored with Prismacolors and felt pin markers.
Wow.
6 issues, 32 pages each. And at some point I thought, well, if I can't do this for a living and it's not taking me to a certain level, it's like, why do I need this old historic stuff? No one's ever going to care. It's like, well, I care now. I'd like to look at those again, but I can picture them in my mind forever. I mean, they're all burned in. So those are gone. I guess it adds a little mystery history to it. And then I was encouraged by a friend's older brother, you should do one that's camera ready. And so that's when I started an actual black and white one, which was Ultra Clutch 81. And in the interim, at about 16, I discovered underground comics, and that was a huge turning point. Because even though I love those old DCs and everything, I never thought, well, I can draw that. That was just a whole different level. I love them, but I couldn't picture myself as that kind of a pro. But when I discovered underground comics, it's like, oh, F yeah, I can be the next Robert Crumb. I can be the next Gilbert Sheldon. Even at that young age, I had a big head. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going to be an underground comic book star. So I made the first issue, drew it in camera ready. I was about 17 at that point. And I drove to San Francisco without making any phone calls or asking for appointments to the existing underground publishers that were still around. I drove my Ford Pinto from Chico to San Francisco, a 3-hour drive, and I bushwhacked my way into Rip-Off Press. I sat down with Fred Todd, who was very kind and looked and encouraging, and I went to the print mint. I think it was Don Donahue, and he was nice. And then I went to Last Gasp. But what I didn't realize was a big part of my infatuation with the undergrounds was a book called The History of Underground Comics by Mark James Estreen. It's an awesome oversized book with a Rand Holmes cover loaded with illustrations. Mm-hmm. It's a great book, but it was published in 1973, which I didn't know that was the beginning of the end where that whole little industry crashed. So I was reading this glowing love affair of this underground medium, and it was all gone, and I didn't know that. So then when I went to Last Gasp, I met with Ron Turner. He's also very nice, a generous person. He says, you could self-publish, and that was no stretch for me. And he said, what we can do is you can gang print this with some other undergrounds. And so it was gang printed. I self-published it, self-financed it, but they gang printed it with, I have some misprints with some Freak Brothers, Fat Freddy's Cat, printed over the cover or on the inside front cover and stuff of other comics, a couple of like misfeeds that came out in the mix. And so I have those still. Yeah. So that was this one. And what else about oh yeah. So Last Gasp also distributed it, thankfully, because I didn't know what I was doing. And I printed 10,000 copies because that in that 1973 mindset, that was what a print run was. Those early comics like the Freak Brothers, some of them had runs as high as 50,000, and they had multiple printings. And every time they did another printing, it was 10,000. And so that gang print up was for 10,000. So whatever those other three books were, they were still using that model. And so did the 10,000. Last Gasp bought 900. And that was all I sold initially. And I saw it as a failure. Saw it as a horrible flop, but really selling 900 copies of your first book is fine. So it was just, I just was learning. And my parents learned by having the other 9,000 copies in their garage.
So are they the people who put up the money? Where did the money come for that?
They co-signed for me to take a loan from a credit union. And I think back then it was only about $800 to print that. Yeah, so big difference. There's a lot of inflation with paper and printing since then. I'm out of touch with that now, but it was, the cover price was only $1.25. And so that was kind of a, a heartbreaker. I didn't know what I was doing. And I thought, oh, this is going to just make a big splash, but it didn't. And so, I wrote to Bud Plant, and I learned, just from reading the indicia of other comics, like Captain Victory #1 had a lot of distributor and aggressive retailer information in it. I canvassed all of them. I never sold any more yet. We'll get back to that. Yet I did not sell any more. So I really felt like I flunked my first assignment. And so that kind of put it into the underground thing. And I spent like 82 and 83 fairly idle. And then I discovered the small press that you referred to. And that is where what gave birth to what was the first 5 issues of Ultra Klutz, which were these they're digestings. A lot of people did the mini comics. Mm-hmm. Excuse me, or the full size 8.5 by 11. These were the digests. I like this format, which is 8.5 by 11 folded once, because to me, I feel like it's more proportional to a conventional comic book with that half digest size. And so I, just if you're curious how I got into this, I was doing a kind of a dopey comic book strip for the Comic Buyer's Guide called Superhero Overdose. I was just trying to find ways to do something a little more mainstream after the underground flop. Was sending stuff to small publishers. And then I wrote to another strip artist in the Comics Buyer's Guide, Francis Mao. And he said, oh, there's this whole world of zines. He called them hardcore comics fans. I later learned there were really mostly other artists, mostly other publishers, who were almost kind of like networking, but it worked. That having that new venue totally inspired me to start over again. So we went from the juvenile one to the underground one. This was actually the third version, or the second reboot of what is now mini reboots. More reboots to come, apparently. And so from 84 and all through 85, I did this as a quarterly while I was in college. So I just had energy to burn back then. And also was quite the hustler. I am in the San Francisco Bay Area. At the time I was in Chico, but I went drive to the stores in Berkeley, Telegraph Avenue. Comics and Comics was a big retailer chain that really had it going on. I went in there and sold copies to them. So even though it started with a mail order photocopy kind of gang, I took it to, hey, there's an email from Roman. I took it to other things like the stores, and eventually got distribution with Friendly Franks, one of the small distributors back before Diamond was the monopoly. There were like 20 distributors back then. Mm-hmm. Friendly Franks was a regional one from the East Coast. And so by the end of this experiment of 5 issues, the first one probably only sold 50, 60 copies to other pals and gals through the mail. And the 5th one, I was probably selling about 300. So that's when I thought, hey, it's about time to graduate from this zine thing and try to work my way back into comics, which now it wasn't mainstream comics, but it was this whole indie thing that was coming on in the direct sales, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles came out in 84, which would have been while I was doing those zines. And as you and a lot of people know, there was a lot of speculation going on. It wasn't just that these are fantastic comics, some of them were, but then it was kind of like, it was almost like people were running out of things to have value. Like, well, I don't want to wait around for my old Silver Age comics to get more expensive. I need to be excited about something being expensive and rare. And these were the perfect bait for the sort of stock market mentality of collecting, which I later learned had already happened with like stamps and coins. People that made things and knew that they made a limited supply and called it rare, like Beanie Babies or whatever. That was what got people going, right?
Yeah, because then in the 90s, everybody fell out of baseball cards and basketball cards, and that's what caused everybody to go in and spike all those Image books, which caused all the
Start
Marvel
all
books.
over.
And then it's just really interesting to see how cyclical things are. And that's why it's super interesting talking to guys who've been around for a while, because you guys have seen this whole thing happen not once, not twice, but now it's happening again.
The Image time period, that happened big time with the variants and the foil covers, embossed covers, and so on. At least with the black and white boom of the 80s, of about 86, it was just the fact that they were black and white. It wasn't too gimmicky, but it was kind of like anybody could make it happen. And for me, it was pure luck of timing. I was graduating college. I was a graphic design major, so I knew how to typeset and do traditional pre-press and all that stuff. And so it's like, I'm going to do the first issue as a nationally distributed comic. And I guess I did a little bit more homework because I got all the distributors and I sent them solicitation packages and did what at the time was expensive. Color photocopies were really expensive, but to send a full size color mock-up of the cover and all the interiors and hype, and I was getting a little more savvy, and that's what led to the next phase, which is not really a reboot but just kind of a repackaging, because then the 5 zine issues became the 5 color cover, nationally distributed, actually internationally distributed. They were sold to all English-speaking countries. They got into Russia and England and Australia and even who knows where, anybody that could use the distributors in the US, Canada, and England. And so I put it all together, sent it all out to the distributors. And I had no idea. My goal was to sell 5,000. That was probably what I needed to be able to make a living cheaply, because I was really cheap. I could live, it's hard to imagine, but I was able to live on $6,000 a year in that time period, which is $500 a month.
Wow.
And that was buying the cheapest food, the cheapest nothing, doing nothing but drawing. I could live on next to nothing. So I figured 5,000 was about right. And the purchase orders came in, and I think I was up to about 13,000, blowing my mind. And I didn't know Diamond was the biggest one, and theirs was the last purchase order. And it must have been about 5,000. I think they were about 30% of the market share back then. So that pushed it up to 18,000. And that's when I dropped to the floor and I ran in circles, like Curly on the Three Stooges, prostate, like kicking in circles, like Curly used to do. I really did that. I was so freaking excited, mind blown that little Jeffy's selling 18,000 copies. So that was like, on the VH1 story, that was the big hit single moment of my life, right?
So as you're moving out from that, you did a piece called Small Press Tirade, correct?
Yeah, I did it. I did it after that. I did it after Ultra Klutz went on hiatus, but it was about that time period. And so it was later when I went on hiatus, I had so much pent up stuff that it's like, well, if I can't do Ultra Klutz, I'm going to do this book that is a scathing. Let me get an image of it. Yeah, so I did Ultra Klutz, the national one, for 2 years, and then I had to go on hiatus, and I did this little Nicholson small press tirade as a mini comic, kind of like going back to my small press days, and really no holds barred, just talked about, whatever you could make sport of.
Yeah, I pulled out my. I realized I didn't even know it. I had the Fantagraphics book that it was reprinted
Oh,
in, and
good.
for anybody interested, Fantagraphics did put out in 1989. I think it's still in print actually, and if it's not, you can get it for
Probably,
super cheap.
yeah. Yeah, a little nice, little handsome hardcover, and I'm one of many artists in that one, The Treasury of Mini Comics, Volume 2. Another story, I'm looking at a couple notes I put there just because I didn't want to forget. One story I've never told, which I want to, enough time has passed that I think it's okay to tell these kind of stories. But you remember Fish Police, or you know of it historically?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It was a came out before mine, and I think it was the next step after Turtles, and then mine. It was a big splash. People were speculating on these kind of comics. Even my first one, like I remember seeing this one in the stores, like with a $10, back when they would put the book in a bag and then put like a Post-it, big Sharpie, $10. I remember seeing this hanging up for $10 a month after it came out. So that was the climate. And selling 18,000 copies, I went to a convention and was sitting with Steve Moncuse and his friends in a bar, and we were the only ones there. So it was kind of like, it's just us. It's like, we can talk about this. And I'm like, with the profit on that many books, that's like $3,000 a month. And him and his little entourage kind of all look at you and like, yeah. It was like this dirty secret. You wouldn't say that in a public because it would just seem kind of creepy, but we were acknowledging like, holy crap. And for context, I think $3,000 a month back then would probably be like $20,000 a month or more now.
Wow.
Oh yeah. So it's like, we're going to be wealthy. That's what it felt like. So it felt like we're at the beginning of a life-changing event. And it wasn't, as it turned out. But at the time, that was why, as a story, I wouldn't just bat around, because it's just kind of weird to acknowledge that you thought, I guess if you were like a one-hit wonder band, it's like, whoa, we're going to be on top forever. And it's like, that's what it felt like. We were just going to be rolling in money. But thankfully, I'm such a prudent person. I love to play with spreadsheets and project how long money will last. So I saved all that money, and all the profits from probably the first 5 issues financed the first 2 years of doing the book. And those books, they didn't lose money, but if they were only making in like, say, the second year, if an issue was only making $300, well, I had several thousand in the bank from the first ones that sold a lot. And I would just kept chipping away at that to keep the dream going, because it was just, one of the best times of my life to be drawing my own comic. It was monthly from 1 to 24. Then it was bi-monthly, 24 to 28. And then it really went down. And I'm not sure why, because the big crash happened around issue 8. A bunch of distributors went bankrupt. The bubble burst. But for some reason, from like issue 25 to 28, it just really slid down to finally where I think 27 was only selling about 1,000, 1,200 copies. And that was about the break even, probably still is. So I put it on a hiatus, and that's when I did the tirade. And another thing I thought of before we close out of that was, I had talked to you about this with you on the phone. I was also so into marketing. At some point, when you're doing these big print runs and you're selling less and less, you have a ton of surplus copies to play with. And this was before Free Comic Book Day, which is now you would just send cartons of those out and they would all get distributed, try to get some new fans from those, overstock. But that wasn't happening. And so I built a mailing list by going to the library at night, the Chico State, and they had walls of yellow pages. And things were so primitive back then, you had to look up under comic books, and magazines, because there was no consistency of where they even listed the stores. And it had this little I guess it was a processor of some kind, early computing device that you could carry, and you could store, 200 characters before it would fill up, and I would take that every night and type in these stores, and I built a list of 3,000 comic book stores across the country. And I learned how to do bulk mail, which, when you get mail from something you don't want, usually it's got that special stamp that you can reckon, it's not first class. So I would use those stamps, stuff envelopes I would probably put in, and there was a weight limit, and I probably could fit in 2 comics. So maybe I'm putting in Ultra Clutch number 16 and number 17, some kind of flyer, some kind of hype, and mail out hundreds of those. Yeah, so it was the would insert, like, say, Ultra Clutch number 16 and number 17 and maybe a flyer and some kind of hype, and go through. You did them by zip code, and so I had all these maps and charts where I would send out hundreds to the western states, then the middle, and then the east, and just feel like I was doing something more than just churning out the comic. So I got pretty creative with those things. And the kind of the punchline of the story is that I don't know if I was getting done with doing that or if I was on hiatus, but I thought, well, I've got this mailing list, I'll try to sell it, and ended up selling it to Diamond Comics distributors. I sent out some feelers to different distributors. Is anybody interested? And I don't know if it was Jeppy or it might have been, called me personally. Is like, I don't believe what I'm seeing. It's like, how did you do this? And they bought it. And I don't remember how much it was probably not that much. It was like $300 or something, but that was, I don't know, you could negotiate for more than that in those 1980s dollars. But so it was a little coup to get some money for the list, and what the hell.
It doesn't get much bigger than Diamond, man. I mean, that's pretty impressive, especially doing everything on your own.
Yeah. I don't know how I did it. I used to work 7 days a week. I used to have to write on my calendar which pages I was doing. I was kind of like a crazy Dave Sim with his schedules and his energy. And he was, of course, another huge influence. Probably while doing the photocopy ones, I discovered him, and his model was just like, it's apparent that this can be done. So unlike the underground thing, fooling myself, it's like, no, there's this guy in Canada, he's doing this, and he's doing it well, and he's successful, and he can hire a guy to do his backgrounds. And I even reached a point where I even asked a couple of people, would you be interested in doing backgrounds? And that's when it started to crumble, and it's like, there's no way I can pay anybody, but it got close to that.
Speaking of Dave Sim, you want to talk just, I am completely torn on Dave at this point, because historically he falls into a category of people that they're not important, they're indispensable. They absolutely changed what was possible in the medium. Dave's personality, I think, has unfortunately gotten a little bit in the way of his legacy. Can you talk just a little bit? For a lot of people that are in their 30s now, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is like, that's when you think of the black and white boom, that is the only comic that you think of.
Right.
For me, it's Cerebus and then TMNT, because really, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was a low rent Cerebus. It's not as well done. It's not as well drawn. It's not as well written. It's not as well printed.
Yeah, the Turtles didn't really turn me on. I felt like it was well executed. They had a style that was good, but it just wasn't my thing. I don't know what category I would even put it in, but Cerebus was just, to me, a factor of 100 above most other books from that period. Just so sophisticated. It certainly influenced me. There's some issues of Ultra Clutch after 8 or 9 issues where people would say, oh, you're doing a Dave Sim, because I would do these, multi-panel, like a person just walking through a scene with no dialogue, kind of crazy stuff that has to be interpreted. And that was all Dave Sim. And he's kind of an enigma. He was a little bit aloof when I first met him, but probably out of necessity, because he just had adoring fans. And so first time he walked up to my table, he's just kind of like, doesn't look me in the eye and kind of flips through it. And I tried to ask him some fawning question, and he's just like, well, when you're up to issue 50, it's just okay. But then over time he became more accessible. And I talked to him on the phone a few times. and he came to help me out in a couple of ways. I guess there was during that hiatus period of Ultra Klutz, I did a single page. He was trying to share the love by printing a thing called the single page, and indie artists could send him a page and he would print it in the back of Cerebus for $150. He was touring with a lot of people. You probably remember there's a certain period of around probably 1990 to 92 where he almost had kind of like a posse. And I was never part of that, but he was touring with James Owen and Clarine Duran and I'm forgetting some of the, Martin Wagner. They had a whole thing going on. We see all this stuff in the back of his book about all their exploits, and it really made you excited. It still made you feel like, this is still achievable. So I love that about him. He was even kind of sponsoring little conventions. I think he was the genesis of what later became Space, and there were a bunch of small shows like that started with him and his energy. And I do want, while I'm thinking about it, I want to tell a little story about this. Another story that I usually don't tell too much because it's kind of weird, but now that it's all history, who cares? So the first book collection, it's jumping ahead a little bit, but this is obviously I Want to Be Dave Sim with his phone books, right? It's completely copies that model. It's 520 pages and it's only book one. This is jumping ahead, but it's a good time for it. Talking about Dave is after Image and the whole thing that we called the distributor wars. Marvel took Heroes World, blah, blah, blah. And it cut to the chase. Everything was going to hell. And distributors needed things that were exclusive. And Diamond went with Image and DC. Marvel had Heroes World. And I think Capital City was left in the lurch with only Kitchen Sink, who had published me. And I don't even think Fantagraphics would pick something. They were like Switzerland. And so I jumped on that. I solicited Ultra Klutz book one with Capital, and their rep said, "Oh yeah, we can use." I said, "It's got to sell at least 750 copies to make a profit, and at $25 a pop." And he said, "Oh, we'll have no problem selling. We'll sell a lot more than that." So I listed it with them, and the orders came in. I don't remember what they were anymore, but they were either in the low or mid hundreds, probably the low hundreds, because it was just Capital, no Diamond. They promoted it really well. I still have some copies of the Advanced Comics catalogs with this big ta-da, Ultra Klutz is coming, and they really worked it, but it didn't sell that much. And I'm like, "Well, sorry, Jeff. We tried." I'm like, "Wait a minute. You kind of made me a handshake promise that you were going to do this." And then I told Dave Sim the story, and he got on the phone and he called Milton Greep at Capital, and he says, "Hey man, you can't do this. You made a deal with Jeff. If you don't honor it, there's going to be trouble." like there's pre-social media, but it was almost like now you would say, your ass is going to be all over Twitter tomorrow. And back then, even in the slowpoke print world, Dave Sim, could have made some trouble, or just made it public,
Sim was one of the few guys that when he spoke up, man, people listened. If he had told people to boycott or like, "Hey, these guys are full of crap, don't work with them," people would have listened. Yeah. He's done some amazing stuff for the entire industry.
That was groundbreaking at the time, for sure.
So kind of while we're a little bit derailed here back in the old days and before we move on to kind of the evolution of Ultra Klutz, one of the main reasons I hit you up is because you got in the comments section of my Don Chen video and talked about how you used to run around with Sam Keith in his Halcyon days.
Yeah, I think we talked about his, which I had forgotten about. He sent me an illo. People used to do things like this back then. Send a little illustration to put in your book.
That's so cool.
So. And I know we also talked about, it's not going to show up in this video, but he used to do this thing where he would ink and then he would take a opaque white ink with a brush and then white over that to get some extra tonality. I don't think I ever had the original because this kind of looks like a copy of a copy. So I don't think I ever had that piece of original art, but you can tell even though it's a little copy of a copy, looks really cool.
For my own personal edification, what issue is that in? Because now I have to buy
That's
one.
number 6.
Number 6? All right.
The first one that I drew after the zines. And it's also when I started getting more, even though Ultra Klutz, sounds goofy, it really evolved into a kind of a comedy soap opera. And this was the one also Sam commented on. I don't know if it was in a letters column later, but he was like, wow, that was really, had a lot of pathos, using the word not as pathetic, but as pathos, like, the Greek meaning or whatever. And so, yeah, so I was starting to get more thoughtful with the characters, and it wasn't all just violent slapstick and stuff like that. And I was trying to think about when I met him. I think it was probably 85 because he was doing Mage. Does that sound right? In 85, still doing Mage?
Yep.
And I remember I had the Mage book. I don't know if you've seen one of these where they just took 4 or 5 early issues and just stapled them together, or
I could get on my bookshelf behind me and literally pull one off.
Yeah, it's like they guillotine cut them and then just did a glue binding, a new cover, but it made all the gutters really tight. So when you're reading the book, it's like crack, trying to see all of it. I remember that, and I remember telling Sam, that's kind of cheesy. And he was like, yeah, that was kind of cheesy. He agreed that, yes, they couldn't. That was the early days of Comico, and Mage was, I think, their only successful comic at the time. That and Grendel, I think, were the only things going. They had some other things like Primer, which they accepted a story of mine, and then Primer folded before it came out. I don't know if Sam was in Primer, but he probably had something he sent them and also never came out. Not sure.
It did. It was actually his first ever professional work, and coincidentally, the name of that story is Max the Hare.
Oh, I must have had that. It was the last issue of Primer, wasn't it?
No, I
6.
Oh, I don't think it's that
Earlier.
late. I think it might be early, because it would have been 19. It was years before his other work for Comico. I think it was 3 years between his work. I think it was 1982 or 1983 when that came out.
Okay.
I think it was second, third issue. I mean, it was
Okay.
right around the time when Grendel came out.
Awesome. I must have had it because that rings a bell. And he was doing Mage, and I don't know who did the coloring on Mage. I don't think Sam did it, but he had a page at a show, and that's why I'm thinking 85, and it was where they would take the line art and shoot it as a transparency, and then do the colors, and then reshoot it as a sandwich with the transparency over the top. And that was how I learned to do the same thing with Ultra Klutz, for example. So the original art for this would be the logos, the price box, the borders, everything that you need to be a crisp black would have been pasted up in black and white, shot as a transparency, and then the color stuff was done underneath or on a light table, and then you flip the front back on. And so that was how I learned to do that, was from seeing that color piece that he showed me. Maybe they gave him one as a gift, and he took it to conventions to show people what he was doing, even though he would say, yeah, I don't want to be known as the guy who inks Mage. But he was inking Mage, and so he had it going on. So I like the guy.
Yeah, Sam always. And speaking of which, when we were talking on the phone, I kind of wanted to hit a little bit on just Sam's personality, because, you know, as we discussed on the phone prior, like, he really underwent like it seems like a very severe personality shift. And can you tell our viewers just a little bit about what Sam was like back in the day?
Yeah, he was, I would think of him as just like the rest of us. I mean, we were mostly pretty nerdy back then. I mean, maybe things are the same now. Maybe comics are a little cooler, but back then it was still kind of a little oddball group of people. We weren't dorks, but we were just into a kind of a fringy thing. And so he just seemed like all of us did. He was a little bit soft-spoken. He was very pleasant and polite, had a good sense of humor. But I don't recall him being, like, down or a downer or anything like that. So if that came about later, definitely was not the Sam that I knew. I remember just, we were all kind of living in that poverty that I talked about. Like, we were super cheap, and we would share hotel rooms with, like 7 people.
Yeah, you were telling me about Sam sleeping in a bathtub, and that was just one of the best things I'd ever heard.
Like, well, there's only so much room in this flop house. This is the old Hotel San Diego, which I'm sure has been demolished. It was the old convention center before that gigantic thing on the waterfront. Now it was old times. You'd have to take turns. Who gets the bed? Who gets the couch? And I guess Sam got the bathtub, or he wanted the bathtub. It was an old-fashioned clawfoot tub, which you also wouldn't see that in a hotel room. It was pretty comfortable. And we would go out to eat at, the McDonald's, which I think is grotesque now. I don't eat fast food, but it's like, well, I have $2 and I want a couple of beers. So I'm going to get 3 69-cent hamburgers at McDonald's, stuff my face with enough calories to get through the night. And that's how we lived back then, just super cheap. And we didn't care. We were happy. So that's what it was like.
And can you talk about the other thing that we talked a little bit about Sam, and something that kind of, I don't know if his memory is faulty, because I'm not sure I quite believe it at this point, but he has a way of distorting and like warping the way things happen. And you talked about Sam and kind of the way he approached storytelling and characters in a way that I thought was very interesting, in that you brought up he kind of wanted a lot of creative control, and he wanted to move in this very unique personal direction with his art and his storytelling and his layouts, but that he didn't quite know what he wanted to do, maybe.
Right, for sure. Yeah, when I thought about it, that was a big part of him that I would have noticed, because I was so obsessed with, obviously, doing a third reboot of something from 5th grade type of thing. It's like, I've always got this core thing that I'm living to do. And I felt he was more like, he really wants to make comics. I don't know if it's because of the ones he read. He didn't just read mainstream stuff. I'm sure he was into a lot of cool esoteric things, but also the mainstream. And he just seemed to have decided, I'm going to do mainstream comics. And I thought he was so talented. I don't think I would have said it, but I was probably thinking, dude, you should just crank out your own awesome comics and people are going to come to the party. But he was more like, no, I want to work for the biggies. And so he did some things on his own, but they were kind of scattershot, kind of like me in 82 and 83, when I was kind of like, I don't know what I'm trying to do here. Sent something to Critters. I did the same thing. Sent something to Critters. Sent something to an old kitchen sink music mag, this comics buyers guy. But I didn't really have this core thing. And I didn't know him when he was doing the Max. And so I wish I called him, because I last talked to him in 89, which I don't think it was that long before the Max, historically speaking, and only 3 years. And I think I probably felt like, because that was probably when I was down in the dumps and he was doing something for Image, and I probably felt like, I don't want to call and pester this guy and like, hey, how'd you make it all happen? I just wasn't my style. I definitely wouldn't have called him when he was doing the cartoon, because that would have felt like, hey, remember me? What's up? Can I get a cartoon? You don't, that's how I think. I don't want to come off like so I never talked to him about the experience with the Max and with the MTV cartoon. Would have been interesting. I only got to talk to him a little bit about the Sandman, because I guess I think you were saying he did an issue of Hulk before that. Is that right?
Hulk would have been after.
So this was his first real big.
He took over Manhunter for DC, and I think he made it all of about an issue on that series. He was working on it. I think it was Ostrander that he was working on that series with, and they just didn't mesh. And Sam left the series before he even completed work on the second issue, and then it went into Sandman.
And I remember talking to him on the phone about that, and I was if that was 80, I guess that would have been when I was on hiatus or coming back and doing, I ended up coming back and doing 4 more issues of Ultra Klutz. That's probably when that was. So I was still in my kind of like, you know, do it yourself or die kind of mode. And he was excited that he just got this big deal at DC, which I didn't realize how big of a deal it was, because at the time it was like Sandman, sounds cool, but now we know it's like, I think that's the birth of Vertigo. Well, obviously Bissette's Swamp Thing is really the birth of Vertigo, but I think Sandman is really what turned it into a line, and then Hellblazer. And I had that first issue of Sandman, which I probably should have kept because it's probably worth a whole bunch of money. I don't know.
It is.
Yeah. I had it, and that's the only one I bought because of Sam's. I think he's only in that one issue. Am I right? Or did he get through
No,
more?
he did 3 issues, I believe, complete. And the third one is the only one that has any, like, I think he got to ink a splash page in that himself. Because he brought in Mike Dringenberg, that I don't know if you ever ran around with him back in the conventions and stuff.
Doesn't ring a bell. No.
Yeah, Mike was a guy that he's the guy he did he invented Death. Yeah, Cinnamon Hadley was a good goth friend of his, and he designed Death, and that's like the only character from Sandman that Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean did not invent themselves. Like Mike was very integral to it. But I think Sam made, I think, like 3 issues into Sandman.
Okay. Do you happen to know, because I don't remember, did someone at DC approach him, either an editor or a writer approach him, or did he have to kind of hustle that gig up?
Sandman?
Yeah.
As far as I know, there are 0 details about that. Because the feeling that I get is that Sam was done with Manhunter. He really felt like he needed to be done, just gone. He didn't get along with anybody on that title, and was really hoping that his first pro work would somehow be a better fit for him than it had been. And when he got to Sandman, I think it was just basically because Neil Gaiman really wanted somebody that had a different style, something that didn't look like everybody else. And Sam really, you know, obviously he fits that. But the interesting thing about Sam and Sandman really is his, I don't want to say that he hates the series, but he hates the series.
Yeah.
He can't accept responsibility or praise or compliments for anything that he did on the series. Yeah. Sam's famously said the only thing that he did on that series was design the mask that goes on Morpheus, and that's the extent of everything he did on that series.
Yeah. Now, when you say he didn't like the series, you mean he didn't like the characters or his experience on it, or unknown?
I think all of the above. I have quotes where he talks about the fact that Sam is very, well, you know, he's very soft-spoken, and Sam is not the kind of guy to be like, hey, man, it really hurt my feelings, or I got upset when. But as I said, the only thing from Sandman that people really associate with Sandman that wasn't designed by Neil Gaiman or Dave McKean was Death. And that's because Neil Gaiman had already done sketches of what he wanted, Morpheus to look like. He had already done sketches of what he wanted ancillary characters to look like. And then he had paid Dave McKean to kind of take those and refine them down even further. And that's what was given to Sam as like, hey, okay, now you can take this and put your spin on it.
Yeah, and he just based on his work prior to that short story that we were talking about, that I think he figured out the name of it, but it was, what was it called?
Wandering Star, I believe.
Wandering Star.
The Wandering Stars. That's what it is.
The one that he wrote, maybe the only one that he wrote. And I remember seeing that in person in a convention. He had the art, and I was just so impressed. It was like, wow, he's doing his own thing now. And it was super gorgeous, super detailed. Maybe so much so that it wouldn't be sustainable as a regular series. But, some things are just don't have to come out monthly, and they can be really high quality. And like The Sopranos, they can come out slower and be better. So I really felt like he was onto something, and was excited. And then when I got that first Sandman, I was like, oh man, he really. I guess now I know, because they made him redo so much of it, that he was probably just like, oh, what have I gotten into? But it didn't have that same crispness, and I guess he was just not into it. I just remember some particular panels of like the Sandman looking through this crystal trap he was in, and it just like, I'm not saying like he was phoning it in, but it was like, you could just see that he wasn't loving it, just looking at the end result. And he was telling me about it on the phone, that he was having to redo it. And that's why I was asking if he was approached or not, because I was kind of clueless, just kind of joking around like, oh, they can just command you what to do, and haha. And he was like, no, it's not haha. And he was like, he wasn't getting fired up, but you could tell he was like, no, this isn't funny stuff. This is really a drag. And I guess since I was so much into my own creative control, I just kind of felt like, well, you could just not do it. And I learned more from working from Vertigo. I made them give me a kill fee when they squelched something. They came to me and said, we want you to do this. And I worked on it, and they said, okay, keep going. And then at some point, no, scrap that, put on the brakes, do it to something different with Mervyn Pumpkinhead. And I'm like, well, you invited me, and so I want a kill fee. And I got one. So I think if he could have stood up for himself, he could have said, what, you want me to redraw 10 pages of the whole issue or whatever the hell happened? He could have just said, you hired me for my style. You've seen my samples. You want all this redone. I want a kill fee, or I want you to give me a 30% page rate, and I'll start over, but I'm not just going to blow all this time with you. And if they didn't do it, he could have just said, well, I'm going to do something else, because the whole world isn't DC and Vertigo and Karen Berger or whatever. That's what
I think that changed for Sam over the years, but there's some interesting quotes where he talks about how he thought you could only make it on the backs of other people's characters leading into the Max. And I think that's kind of the mentality that mentally forced him into doing that Sandman.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to thank you for sharing that story about Vertigo with the kill fee, because I think it also goes to show Sam really doesn't stick up for himself. I'm not sure that he ever had an inordinately high, thought process of himself in any way. And it's really interesting that you brought up the fact that it felt like he was phoning stuff in, because Sam literally said the more they made him, he had done 40 pages when they made him restart. And yeah, he said the farther he got into redoing it, the more he said, when I would have a thought of like, oh, this is how I would lay it out, he reverse engineered that. How would I not lay this out? Because that's how Karen and Neil would want it. And I think like the major blow on Sandman, I think when he decided that he was done and gone, was when Karen came to him and was like, we're going to have Dave McKean do covers, by the way. Like you don't even get to do the fun stuff.
Right.
And he was like, well, hey, Neil, maybe. And Neil really quickly was like, no, I think Dave should do the covers. And historically, I think maybe he made the right call, but that was it. Yeah, because, it's like you said, Sam he seems almost apologetic about the level of skill in his art at that time period, because he knew that this was not a sustainable 30, I'm going to get out 30 pages of this in 30 days. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. Because he was always trying to pull back, but that was one of the points where it became very apparent that his career was not going to play out the way that he had hoped.
Yeah, it makes me curious how it could get that deep without some checks and balances. Like, the time you could be faxing them a couple of pages and getting some feedback, and which is what I did. And I don't know if he inked it as well, but he was just penciling.
He just penciled. Karen Berger also did this to Mike Allred. And like Mike Allred didn't have to redraw an entire issue, but like she so viscerally attacked his skill level that Mike Allred turned around and like it's the entire reason his career started. He said he owes Karen Berger for that. But I get the feeling with Sam, it was the exact opposite. It was just the boot heel to the throat that kind of drove him into a shell.
Yeah, I can see how, you know, my Vertigo book, it was more of a protracted affair. It took 3 years from when they called me till when it was printed, because of it's just a ridiculously long story over one comic book. But you know, there were mostly political things that stalled it, but there were some rewrites and some art adjustments, and it just kept going on and on. And I did reach a point where they wanted something changed at the end after. I'm pretty sure it was even after I mailed in the physical copies, because I would have been sending in photocopies for approval. And after I had sent in the final boards, it's like, oh, we need you to make more of these characters women. And of course, you know, now that would be, no one would blink at that today, but in 1996, it wasn't as much of a thing. And I had done the issue and there were women in it, but it was a very male oriented story. It just was. And I just refused. I just said, no, I'm not drawing anything different now. I've done all your changes. I've been at your beck and call for 2 years. And I just didn't negotiate. I just said, no, not doing it. And what are they going to do? It's done. Got to move on. So I think he could have utilized some of that kind of clout, but you know, he was younger too. He was younger than me when I don't know if he's younger than me or not, but he would have been a younger man doing that first Sandman than I was when I did my issue of The Dreaming. So, and it was his first assignment. So there's all that, but he definitely could have worked either a kill fee or I don't know.
I just thought it was interesting, and you're one of the very few people, Sam, really, he just cut himself off from the entire world. One by one, it seems like most of the people that he spoke to, that he kept in contact with, he either just stopped reaching out to, or he kind of cut out of his life for one reason or another. It's a sad story, man.
Well, another component probably is, I don't know his experience with the Max, but I do know that Ultra Klutz was optioned for television. I don't know if you know that, but by Rankin and Bass for 2 years. And then Nelvana was interested, but it was already optioned. And then when the Rankin Bass expired, I reached back to Nelvana, and whoever their agent or whatever they're called was no longer with them. So there was no one there who knew or cared anymore. But in hindsight, I think I'm just so glad none of that happened, because I feel like it just would have probably ruined everything for me. And so he probably went through some terrible things like that with MTV. You know, at the time, I like, whoa, Sam's really made it when I see the stuff on the screen. But it was probably not so great of an experience. So,
yeah, I'm not gonna get into details, but MTV dumped a multi-million-dollar lawsuit into Sam's lap, using a opt-out clause in their contract, saying that he had created the Max, so it really wasn't their problem, and just kind of like threw it on Sam.
Yeah, what a horror story. I mean, that would be even if you never had to pay it, just to have those kind of things hanging over you would be very difficult.
And I'm sure that there were a lot of hangers on and stuff, but like Dan Fraga from Image, I don't know if you're Fraga Boom.
No.
He did like Black Flag and a couple other real big, good books for Image when they started. And he checked out a couple of my videos. And Dan said that, and this blew me away, like when they were trying to do some other stuff with the Max, and when they were trying to get a hold of Sam, people at Image did not have his contact number. And when they wanted to put the Max back out through Jim Lee's Wildstorm, they had to get a hold of a friend of Don Chin's who had interned as an anchor on one of the first issues of the Max, because that was one of the only people that Sam had kept in contact with. It was crazy.
Yeah. I could see that though. I've been through some times where you have it's a roller coaster ride and you have those highs and then you have those lows. And sometimes you just feel like I'm never going to go to another convention. I mean, I don't want to talk to anybody. I just need to get in my own head for a while. And so I can relate to that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I don't mean it as a I know a lot of people hear me ask these questions about Sam. They see the title of my video, they hear me harping on these what they would consider negative aspects of Sam's life or maybe his personality. And that's absolutely not my intent. I just want to learn more about the guy, and because he's so withdrawn and it doesn't he's not incapable of communication, but it seems like almost incapable of like pure intellectual truth communication about what happened. I just always like to dig deep. I'll stop beating the Sam Keith thing to death. Let's get back to your career. We were talking a little bit about how when Ultra Klutz was moving, with the phone book and all of that stuff, kind of moving into the more mainstream, what all was going on at that point? Were you reaching any kind of burnout point with the character or with trying to get things done yourself? Because that is a lot to take on.
Yeah, I was more burnout on the publishing frustrations because I thought at the time I thought, oh, I could do this for 10 years. I'm sure I would have tapped out on material, but I just thought it could go on forever. But it did start to get a little bit, like we talked about the pathos. I was trying to do more of the cosmic soap opera. And it was getting harder to mesh that with stuff that was just funny. I think Cerebus, I think Dave Sim was better at that, but I think that's a good parallel as Cerebus got really serious, could still be funny, but it was harder for it to be funny, So there was some of that. And I think what saved me was the next project after Ultra Klutz. I think it was during one of the hiatuses is when I came up with Through the Habit Trails, and I got some of those here. So there's three editions. There's the first, they were done as chapters, short stories. I think for a modern audience, I would almost say they're kind of Black Mirror, very dark humored, like super dark humored. Like when I read these, it's like, who wrote this? It's really hard for me to relate, but I'm sure a lot of those, kind of career crushing moments led to this, because it's about dark humored look at working, not for the man, but just for any kind of corporate artistic pursuit, which can be something like a crummy little newspaper or a big fancy advertising house. And that was kind of a blend of that I was doing during the hiatus. I was so resentful that every pen stroke I drew was for someone else, because I thought I can do Ultra Klutz for 10 years, but I have to draw, Little Caesars ads or Santa Claus on a mountain bike at Christmas time, and just all that dreck that artists have to do for a living. And I really hated it. And so it led to this narrative, this super dark narrative. And that goes back to Dave Sim, where I sent him a single page. I probably didn't even write one as a single page, but I did one for him. The other ones were like 4 or 5 page chapters. He loved it. So I sent him a 4 or 5 page version for Cerebus preview. And they didn't pay for the previews. He paid for the single page, but I still had the balls to call up the secretary and say, and I'm getting 150 page for these too, right? She's like, no, we don't do that. And I'm like, well, I don't remember how I did it, but he paid me 150 page for the Cerebus preview. Cause I think cause he really liked it. I don't know if he would have done that for other people, but he liked it so much. I'd gotten a call from Kamiko before they folded. They were interested in it. He's like, let's get a bidding war going on this. And he sent copies to Steve Bissett, who was on his early issues of Taboo. He had founded Spider Baby Graphics. I'm a huge Bissett Swamp Thing fan. I actually am more attracted to Steve's art than Alan Moore's stories. And I always have to put out this plug, Steve, if you're listening. he did 2 or 3 issues before Alan Moore came aboard, and they blew my mind and they kick ass. And for me, Swamp Thing evolved when Steve came aboard, even though Alan wrote those great stories shortly afterwards. So Steve's the man. He loved it. He wanted to publish it in Taboo, and so off we went until he started having some financial troubles. I think he was selling good numbers, but they're very expensive to produce. I think you've seen or you have the Taboo volumes. Mm-hmm. They're thick. They're beautifully illustrated. So well done, in fact, that I had sold all the artwork years ago. And when I did the digital remastering, I bought copies of Taboo and sliced them up and scanned them because they're just perfect photography and lithography. Every detail is captured. So thanks again, Steve, for helping preserve those. And so that was the Habit Trails. They didn't all come out in Taboo, so I ended up self-publishing the first one. I guess that was another roller coaster ride. Because Ultra Klutz was more of a cult following kind of a thing, I had a lot of passionate fans, but I never got great reviews. I was always snubbed by the Comics Journal. And so Habit Trails came out, and I was like, wow, I was getting like that kind of, what do you call it? That sort of editorial or editor's favorite kind of thing, even though it wasn't even all published yet. And it just created a buzz. I guess it got more respectability. And again, I got an Eisner, my first Eisner nomination. I've had 6 of those over the years. That was my first one for short story, The Dry Creek Bed. So I thought, well, this is going to just catapult me to superstardom, like back when I was going to do my first Underground, kind of like, yay, it's all happening again. Very exciting. And when I did the first edition of the Collected, it sold 1,100 copies, which is not that bad now, because a book should have a long shelf life. It shouldn't all sell out of the gate like a perennial comic book. So that was okay. That was it made money, or it may have broke even, because it's like, well, I want to print 2,000 because I want to have some on hand. So might have been a break even at 1,100, but I was still demoralized. I thought, oh, here we go again. It's just, a break even affair. Didn't make a big splash, didn't change my life. And so that was kind of tough. And then it gets worse. Hang on, kids. So then I think it might have been one of the times I quit comics. Well, then I did Father and Son next. I'm not going to dwell too long on that. I'll just hold some up. Just because it was a chapter in the career that was good for me, because these were done with Kitchen Sink after the first edition of Habit Trails. And I was thrilled because Kitchen Sink is a fantastic old From the Underground publisher. And they didn't last much longer after this. And I'm pretty sure this is the very last humor comic that they signed. So that's a special thing for me. Dennis is a great guy. I told him years later at a convention how happy I was to have worked with him. And he's like, Jeff, no one ever tells me that. Everybody just ends up getting pissed off and bitter and thinks I should have done more. And he's like, thank you. You actually came up and told me that. I'm like, God, everybody should. So
massive amount of respect. I'm sorry, that's insane. I've
right?
never heard that before. Those guys were, they're from that underground scene. People do not remember they were from that original, at the last wave of that underground scene, trying to keep it alive.
For sure, yeah. So I guess people can just get disgruntled, but he did me a good turn. And so that was fine. And it was paid. It was a $50 a page rate, which was good at the time. It was during, and then it got killed by the distributor war. So they went exclusive with Capital. It sold well. I think the first issue sold 3,700, which was respectable, and we were encouraged. And then, sales always drop after the first one. And then the 4th issue was during the Capital exclusivity distributor war fallout, and it probably dropped down to a little over 1,000 or something. And so that was that. I couldn't blame them. But so then I was pretty much done with comics. That might have been like when I threw away all those proto comics. I threw away all the original art to the Underground one. Nobody owns a page of that except for the covers. And I kept the covers for 30 years, and I just sold the front and back covers last year. So all the interiors of the Underground, it's never been reprinted. There's no one has those pages.
Breaks my heart, man.
Us artists, we have our little fits. And so, but then what was really tough was then, okay, I'm going to get on the horse again. That's when I did the Ultra Klutz book 1. And, you know, it got published. That gave me a little boost. And then I decided I'm going to do a second edition of Through the Habit Trails, probably the more well-known one. And I went after the book trade. So believe me, I've been through it all. It's like I kind of gave up on the Diamond and all the comic store game. And it's like, I'm going after the real distributors. And so you don't pre-solicit in that world. You got to commit to a print run and then start trying to hustle it and get a distributor. And so I printed 3,000 copies, and I got the Diamond was at this point the monopoly. I got the purchase order from Diamond, which I thought would at least maybe float the printing cost and give it a kickstart. They ordered 300 copies of this supposedly famous book for this edition. I couldn't believe it. I thought this has to be a mistake, but it was not a mistake. And it's probably not so uncommon now, probably not at all. But so I had just invested like $6,000 in 3,000 copies of that book, and I ended up selling them all. I ended up getting one traditional distributor out of Oakland, and then like Barnes and Noble and Baker and Taylor were they're kind of like fake distributors. They carry your book, but they just give you reorders for onesie, twosie copies whenever a store orders one. So you're packing up and shipping one book, and they're taking 60% or whatever. So, but I really worked it. I sent out things to all the publishers, all the newspapers for reviews. I have a little collection of reviews from, you know, legit newspapers and stuff. And so I really worked that whole deal. And I could see how it had bankrupted some other publishers. I think First Comics is an example. There are a lot of publishers that just tried to go deep with that, and then you can end up having a lot of returns, and it's a tough market. But I tried.
Yep. Which
is another reason I'm interested in going digital now, because, you know, like I said, I sold all those books, but it took me up, and you know, there are many long periods, sometimes some decades, where I just wasn't actively trying to sell them. But I've had Habit Trails and Ultra Klutz book 1 in my closet up until just a couple of years ago. So, you know, those print runs all sold out, but they took years and years and years. And now when you hear these stories, you can see, wow, well, there's no logical reason to do another printing when I can just do it digitally. It's like, why would I do another 1,000 or 3,000 copies and try to twist everybody's arm into buying it? Not the fans. I know the fans would support it, but trying to get Diamond to carry it. You know, I remember when I was still working at the tail end, when I was doing Colonia, I was like trying to get them to relist these old books like Habit Trails and Ultra Klutz book 1, try to make a special event out of it. Like, well, tie it to an issue of Colonia, and we'll do all these. And the rep's response is just like, well, I can't be listing all this old stuff. And it's like, dude, this is my career. This is my life's work. To you, it's just this old stuff that you can't take 1 column inch of without graphics, lines of type to relist in your big fat catalog. So,
and that's a real shame, because I have to admit that I love Through the Habit Trails. Like, Taboo was, I mean, it was a big game changer for me growing up reading that. It just visually, it was, as you said, immaculately put together. Some of the stuff that you read in there was, you weren't going to see that anywhere else. Maybe Dan Klaus or somebody like that was messing around with something like that. But man, it is, I didn't know that there was more through the habit trails until I was doing research on this, and now I'm really bummed out to find out that there are those collections that I don't own.
Oh yeah. And then there's a third one. Well, I'm going to set you up. So I'm gonna get you the underground one, and then I have one of these that I can scare up if you don't have this one.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I'm not begging for copies. All I meant is that now I get to start eBay hunting.
Oh yeah.
Because I gotta have that, man. I love Through the Habit Trails. It really, something about it, just that dark humor in it really struck a vein with me, man.
Thanks.
Ultra Klutz was amazing, and it was awesome as a gate opener to me as a kid. And then I remember seeing your name, and that was right around the time when I was starting to put together, like, oh yeah, well this is the same guy that did this and did that, and like I should be following these guys and looking through the credits and stuff. And you're one of the things that attracted me to Taboo, and I will be forever grateful for that.
Thanks. Yeah, it was real different for me for sure. Ultra Klutz wasn't nearly that dark. It was a little dark sometimes, but yeah, Habit Trails went all out. And there was the third edition with Dover, which was cool. I was kind of done with it. But they wanted to do a new edition that has a new epilogue.
Oh, okay.
I'm kind of jumping ahead because that was after I retired from comics. What else? I wrote a few things down. I think that's just leaves Colonia. Oh, this is fun. All right. A couple of visuals here just because I pulled them out. Klutz buttons. I used to sell buttons. Found some of these. Speed. I used to do these superhero parodies. My version of the Flash is called Speed. He's a speed addict, smokes cigarettes, and he's all lethargic until he runs fast. And this is funny. So here's a great example of how I thought I'm going to be doing this for a living forever. After the early Trek Cells Ultra Klutz that sold 18,000 copies, I printed up my own artboard, non-photo blue ink layout boards with my logo, my phone number, P.O. box, and a phone number, a landline. Hello, Klutzophone here. But that's how invested I was. This is from issue 14, and I was cranking these out. I was doing a page a day and monthly, and this is what those old boards look like. That.
Can we talk a little bit about Lost Laughter too?
Oh yeah. So that was after Habit Trails, and that kind of where I was kind of getting confused with Ultra Klutz of it being dark versus funny, and so I split it into two, and I did Ultra Klutz Dreams, which were short stories that appeared in Hyena magazine by Tundra. So I've been with a lot of publishers in different forms, weird little one-off things, but I did these Ultra Klutz Dream stories with Tundra.
Was that when Eastman was still doing it then?
Eastman was still actively involved, and Mark Martin was the editor.
Okay.
Nat Rat. Remember Mark Martin?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And Lost Laughter. Okay, this is a good story. So, and maybe not as well known. So the Xerec Foundation. Mm-hmm. Both Turtle guys helped me out a lot. Kevin Eastman was Tundra and printed some stuff, but more so he helped Steve Bissett during his troubles get refinanced to keep Taboo going. So Turtle guy number one did that. Turtle guy number two, Peter Laird, set up the Xerec Foundation, and I was in the very first group.
Really?
When it was first launched. That was Lost Laughter. So I read about it in the Comics Buyer's Guide. This new foundation, you can submit your comic. And I was in the first group of 4 that got accepted in early 1993. I'm gonna pull those out. Yeah, so this is when I was, not selling, still just trying to come up with ways to make it work. So the foundation, I think it gave me $5,000 to publish with. Things changed a lot. They were learning, but in that first year, that first group, these are the books. Another bright idea was I'm not going to pay for color separations. So I'm going to come up with kind of an aesthetic of this dark, alternating black and white covers. And hopefully nobody notices that I'm not paying for color and I'm saving some money like that. So this was the sequel to Ultra Klutz, Lost Laughter. And it was inspired by, not just by Habit Trails, but comics at that time, this whole grim and gritty thing was the trend, or was the trend of the 3 years prior, maybe. So it's like, well, I'm going to take a hand at this. And so I made this sort of dark, dystopic version of the Ultraclutz universe, all got turned on its head. And the ironic thing was I was going to advertise it like crazy, or no, the other way around. I wasn't going to advertise it. I was just going to spend all the money on printing to get as many issues as possible. And the foundation said, well, you have to spend it in a finite period of time. So I couldn't spend it over the course of 4 bi-monthly issues. So then I doubled down on the ads, and I did full page ads in like the Comics Buyer's Guide, Comics Journal. I don't know if I even did, probably Comics Retailer. Spent a ton of money on advertising, was doing a new spin, this grim and gritty thing. And I think the first issue sold something like 800 copies, because this was when Image was blowing everything up. At least, I can blame others than myself, but there was certainly a lot of distractions going on in the comics. I was kind of yesterday's news, and everybody was all about those variant covers of X-Men #1 selling 1 million copies. And it's just like, I was toast at that time. So I ended up, doing all the ads, doing the issues, and then just couldn't keep it going. So it was another experiment.
So was it kind of just, when I read Lost Laughter, it is such an interesting tie between the very early playful nature of Ultraclutz, but it very deftly ties. It seems like a lot of things that maybe you learned on through the habit trails, like storytelling wise and that kind, and art wise especially as well.
You know what? I think probably some of the biggest influences, when I reread these, sometimes I don't read these for like years, like 5-7 years, and I read them again, and it's like, oh God, I forget how much of an influence was Alan Moore. And also I hadn't read his stuff in so long. I finally got the Miracle Man collections, and I read those, and it's like, oh man, this completely shaped my latter things like Lost Laughter. I mean, that whole weird world of what if a happy-go-lucky character was actually this sort of dark, weird nightmare world, and no one knows what's going on. That completely influenced Lost Laughter. So I think that it's all about Miracle Man, and the Dark Knight was a Watchmen, all those things that were like revisionist hero comics, I think got me excited about trying that. It was a weird experiment.
So did you enjoy working on it? It felt like it was more of a growing experience than like a joyous experience maybe for you to be working on?
Yeah, it definitely was. It was like, best way to describe it is when I was doing the old Ultraclutzes and the new one, which we'll talk about later, but those things wrote themselves. Those were like, I wake up at night and stuff's coming. I'm on a hike. The stories are coming. They're following me. It's like, I better write this down at some point because it's just happening. Lost Laughter was more like, I'm going to sit down. I'm a writer. I'm going to sit down at my computer and my assignment, right? That's the difference.
I wondered it kind of felt like it was not forced, but it just felt like you were kind of trying to maybe work through something. I've always really enjoyed it. So
yeah, it was not my best effort. There were times when I just completely disliked it. I like it okay now, but it's like it's one of the, like, if you didn't bring it up, I was probably not going to bring it up.
Okay, well then we won't harp on it, man.
No,
sorry.
Yeah, no, it's all part of the tapestry, which is the fun part of getting old, is now you can have all this weird history, and this led to that, and that led to that. Perfect segue is, I think, because that grim and gritty thing was so, it was kind of a chore, and kind of draining, and for that same reason, it's like I could never do a Habit Trail sequel. I did a 10-page epilogue, but I could never do 80 pages of anything that dark anymore. It really is exhausting. And so then the next thing was Colonia, which was a way to completely turn that around. So this is now being inspired by like Jeff Smith's Bone. There were a lot of these sort of lighthearted, all ages friendly books were happening around, I don't know if it was 96 or 7. So it would have been after the issue, The Dreaming, I did. And I had done Father and Son, Ultra Klutz, Hair Trails. I pretty much had done everything, because Father and Son goes back to my teenage years as well. So I kind of gotten all the things out of my system that I ever thought I would do. So Colonia was the first thing that was like a clean slate, like I want to do something lighthearted. And that one also just came flowing out. You know, the ideas would just come while I'm out hiking and couldn't stop myself. You know, it's like some books you have to try to do, and some books it's like, try and stop because this is coming, you know. And that was one of those. And you're going to see a pattern here, but once again, it started out really strong. I think the first issue sold, might have only been like 2,800, but enough to justify a 3,000 run, no problem. That was not happening for people like me at that time. So that was like, wow. Like, and I got really good reviews. People were excited about it. I did my very first second printing. So the only comic I ever did a second printing. You can see the slight difference, like put my logo on the next one, slightly different. And it sold well enough to quit the day job and try to give it my all, go full time with it. And so I did that. It did well, but then the same old thing, it just started selling less and less. And just like Ultra Klutz and Father and Son, by the last issue, which was number 11, it was down to 1,000 copies, which is really hard to figure because there are also some collected editions. So the first issue of Colonia has a 3,000 run, a 1,000 reprint run, and I think about a 1,000 run trade paperback, which means there's 5,000 copies of story number 1 out there in the world, but there's only 1,000 copies of issue number 11. And it's on a par in quality, I'd say. So that's just the way it goes. You know, you're in the radar of the stores and people's excitement. And then, you know, I don't know what happens. They're onto something else, less room in the store. I've never been able to dope it out, but all I know is that comics will just keep selling 5 or 10% less every issue, even if you start making them better and better. And that's just what happens.
Well, I mean, not to get back and harp on this, but because we talked about it before, and because I have very close relationships with all the LCSs local comic shops that I've always frequented throughout my life, it's something that I've always kept a tab on and asked people about. And it's just the conventional wisdom of like, hey, that first issue is going to be worth money, and you can expect to see at least a 20% drop off between issue 1 and issue 2 on average for even like a Venom title or something. It's ridiculous. I suppose it comes back to like that whole collector's mentality that started in the 80s and moved into the 90s, which has become so prevalent with people who purchase hard copy comics. And it sucks because I am a hard copy collector. I'm surrounded by, I think I've got 35,000 comics and then maybe 1,000 plus hardcovers, and then God knows how many trade paperbacks.
Oh my gosh.
I'm obsessive, and I've read them all. I love stories, and the thing that I have run into more and more in my life, you get towards the end of that series, good luck finding those issues if you didn't buy them off of the stands.
Like that last issue of the Max is, I guess, like really rare because it's a low run, right?
35. I've seen copies of that over the last year go from, I thought it was nuts when I was paying $25 for a copy of one of those, you know, like, oh my God, this is 10 times what I pay for issue 1. And I've seen copies of those go for several $100 at this point.
That's
now.
Nuts.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy.
That is crazy. Because I just bought a set of Captain Victory, which also would have had probably greatly diminishing numbers. 81 to 84. Mm-hmm. And because it's the only, I have all the Jack Kirby stuff in the hardcover. You know, it's just love that stuff, and that's the only one that doesn't have a collection. And I picked up a whole set in, you know, very fine, you know, condition for like $60. It's like I probably would have paid 40 or 50 for a hardcover, so that seems fair for 14 issues.
Yeah, oh yeah, man.
I thought I got a good deal.
I love Captain Victory. That series is so weird.
I feel like when I started drawing again, I feel like I'm Jack Kirby doing Captain Victory, because he started getting kind of wonky, and I'm feeling a little wonky. I'm feeling better now that I'm rolling. I'm doing a page a day again. But when I first started up again, it was like, what am I doing?
So let's get, sorry, I kind of derailed stuff there a little bit. So with Oceana, you know, you started out really strong, and then stuff it finally hit a point where, you know, it was not monetarily viable to continue on with the series.
Right.
But as a guy who's followed your career, what I found really interesting was with almost everything else that you have ever done, even when you hit that point, you somehow mentally, monetarily, physically, spiritually found a way to tie up all of those stories and complete that. And Oceana was the first thing where you did not do that, correct?
Yeah, Colonia.
I don't know why. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I keep saying that. Yeah, Colonia.
Yeah, no problem.
Can you talk a little bit about why?
Yeah, your observation is spot on, because I really did, like even Lost Laughter got finished in a negative burn. Like I just had to get it done, and I did chapters in someone else's comic because it's like I have to get it done. Everything else I had to get done, but something about Colonia was so different, because a combination, I guess, of how much research I did, how much was drawn. I really relearned to draw. I mean, I drew out of my head my whole life, and you know, in Ultra Klutz, everything. Steve Bissett called it Tinker Toy, and it's like everything. Yeah, it's all. That's why I was fast, because I just made it up. And Colonia was all about from reference. I mean, I got anatomy books. I used to have rows of videotapes. The internet wasn't as helpful back then, but I had all these like A&E documentary pirate ships, and you know, all these seafaring, you know, references. And I was just hardcore studying the clothing, the props, the ships. I built an entire alternate world with a whole different history. And so I guess it was exhausting. It took me about twice as long to draw. So it was much more time consuming, and focused equals exhaustion sometimes to draw. And I wasn't getting as much feedback on the world building that I was doing. So it was like you remember how people used to get so excited about Cerebus, like, what is he doing? What does that mean? He was asleep on a bench and he skipped an issue, and then he woke up, and what was the secret that happened? And I was the same way. I was like, I hung on every word, and what are all the, he's making up this world and everybody's trying to second guess what it's about. And I didn't get that so much with Colonia. I just didn't get that fan involvement. They liked the comic aesthetically and it entertained them, but they just didn't dig into this big world that I was creating and just scratched the surface of it. And then also, I kind of overextended myself. I tried as a last hurrah to do it bi-monthly while I was still working full-time as more of an adult man in his mid or his late 30s. Yeah. And I did it bi-monthly, and I completely burned out. I mean, it was like nervous breakdown time. It was like I was just shattered. It's like, what am I doing? I just worked so hard to get those last 3 issues out, and they didn't go up in sales. It was just like, it was not hard to stop.
Kind of soul crushing to be putting all of that time and effort into everything and getting so little feedback. And that's something that I hear from people of our age. You know, I mean, yeah, obviously you're a little bit older than I am, but Was that the letters pages and the kind of community and communication that you used to have was all but gone, and people were jettisoning letters pages, and it's all on the internet, and getting
Right.
people's feedback was just such an integral part of keeping that energy going. I can't imagine trying to work a full-time job and putting out a comic book that you were doing
Oh yeah.
all yourself.
It was like, yeah, I was like, okay, every night after work, I'm going to do a third of a page and then full pages on the weekend. And yeah, it was too much. And I was living in an apartment in Oakland, kind of like a urban environment. It was just not like college young man's poor man, $500 a month, living on top ramen and Chico. It was like this dude that's like, I'm not building any retirement for myself here, so it just part of aging, I guess, that you just can't keep going at it like that. And so I did do some new pages of Father and Son for that omnibus. I did the Habit Trails epilogue, but Colonia, I don't think I could ever, I can't never say never because I'm doing Ultra Klutz again, but that level of commitment, my fantasy, the only thing I fantasize about is if it ever got optioned for some kind of a show. I don't think they could make a movie, but now with all these limited run things on Netflix, I think it could be a really cool one season event. And I would love to be like an executive editor, or what do you call it, creative consultant. I'm no Hollywood guy, but I would love to be there to help them finish it. So that's I could be invested in that, but I couldn't just sit at the boards and just crank out issues and issues and issues just to call it done.
Would you be interested in returning to the story if something like that happened, where if you were given the opportunity to do the show? Do you even know what the conclusion would be? Because I always got the feeling you kind of knew where everything was going.
Yeah, I pretty much knew that. I know the end, and I know some of the big twists in the end, and how some of the characters would develop. And I think it only would have been, I think what I did was about 2/3 of it. So there might have only been another 6 or 7 issues to do the last arc, which was called The Way Home, which I wrote and did a bunch of thumbnails of. I put those on my website. I thumbnailed about 20 pages or so, and I knew where it was going. So yeah, it was pretty well planned out. So yeah, if it was, yeah, whether if it was a show or something happened in my life where like some entity were like, we want to reprint it and finish it with a different artist. Yeah, I could dust everything off and figure that out, but just couldn't draw it.
Artistically, just not willing to go back there.
Yeah, it's just too much. It's just even Ultra Klutz is a challenge. The new series I'm doing is only going to be quarterly, even though I'm retired, because I don't want to have any kind of burnout, stress out. I may be able to do them faster, but I don't like, if I said I'm just going to be bi-monthly, it's like, that's not a good idea. I'd rather consistently and successfully put out a quarterly book for the next 2 years than stumble and do 3 bi-monthlies and then say, I'm tired.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. I get that on the channel a lot, man. I come home and I'll do 10 hours of editing for, 3 or 4 weeks. And then I'll hit this point where I literally just like, I don't want to do this anymore. It is so much. Like, God, I just got home from a 10-hour day and I did 10 more hours. What is wrong with me? I'm 35. When is this masochism going to stop?
Yeah, that's got to be labor intensive.
So, you talked about just hitting a point where, you were done. You'd had a few points in your career, obviously, where you were sure you were done with comics. I mean, you threw away stuff. What has kind of motivated you to come back to Ultra Klutz?
I'm not entirely sure. I had to read some of my own notes to try to figure that out, because it just happened like within a few days. I went from like you said, the last quit was 2005, and I've done a mere 20 pages in the last 15 years for those two collections. 5-10 years ago, if someone said you're going to be doing Ultra Klutz again full time, I'd say you're crazy. You don't know me. And so I think some of it might be the COVID year was so awful, and just really bad things happened, and it's like, it's hard to explain. It's like, if the world can change this much and go so south, then why not? Why not do something goofy with the rest of my time? I think that's why, probably a fair amount of it. And then I think the idea for the approach cemented it. I don't know why I was even thinking, well, okay, I like to tell this story. So the reason I would even be thinking about it is because I've done so many series that either got completed or, like Colonia, did not get completed. I have reoccurring dreams where I have a series that's part done, and I have all these pages, and these didn't get printed, and this part wasn't done. And they're like those old dreams where you're in college and you forgot to study in its finals day. It's like, there's those recurring dreams that we all have that nag at us. And I have these dreams that I have unfinished comics, and it's so vivid. I wake up, it's like, wait a minute, there really is? No, I guess there's not. And so I'm always trying to figure out what to do with that mental energy. And when I think about Ultra Klutz, that's like kind of the last thing that needs more, because it really did get completed between Lost Laughter and the 31 issues. It's got an ending. It's a complete story. And so, could I do anything else with it? I could reboot it again. It's like, no, that won't work. I can't redraw the same stories, because it'd be like people that re-record their old albums. It's like, it doesn't sound the same, man. It's like, I liked it when it was kind of crusty, So that's not going to work. And then I thought, well, what if I had stories that fit in between the old issues? And that kind of started to turn me on. It's like, okay, it's scenes that we never saw, but they fit the continuity. And a great example I can give, if you ever were a fan of the show Lost. Mm-hmm. So I was really into Lost, so much that my little dabbling with editing, I did a recut of Lost in chronological order, because they had so many flashbacks. Yeah. And time traveling, I did a recut that's chronologic, but only the scenes on the island. Anyway, that's how my mind thinks. So what this is like, the ones that I've written the second and third issue already. I've drawn the second issue cover, but the first one's not even out yet. So this is happening. It's like Lost. They do a season, they present all this material, then halfway into the next season, they introduce Benjamin Linus, and he's supposedly been on the island the whole time. And then they start showing these scenes of what he was doing while the plane was crashing and all this kind of cool stuff. So that's what I'm doing. I'm doing scenes that fit somewhere off camera between other scenes that occurred. And I'm actually trying to cross-hatch the way I used to, because I stopped working like that. I'm doing the heavily cross-hatched. I'm trying to keep it light, trying to sprinkle on a little bit of a modern eye and how I would think about it at my age, but not change it too much. So it's almost like a weird parallel retelling of the story, but nothing is going to be the same or bore anybody like, oh, I saw this, So that's the genesis.
I'm so excited, man. I couldn't believe when you got back to me after I talked to you and you're like, yeah, by the way, I'm rebooting Ultra. Like, what?
It's ridiculous. So this is the first cover. I think it's you can see it online in color. It looks much better with the logo. I did a retro logo with old-fashioned price box and stuff. And it's one of the characters, like Fiji. She doesn't even show up until issue 7, but I'm showing what was going on with her at the time. It starts the day after Ultra Klutz arrived on Earth. So the first issue is called The Next Day, and it shows things that were happening that we didn't know about. And some of them will be things Some of them will be things that I'm coming up with brand new, but they're also are things that I was thinking about back then, but I never did. So they're little plot points that I thought about that I had never done. And then there's just some completely silly stuff like this sequence, the turtle monster, to kind of show how can you keep fighting these monsters over and over and have any kind of a status quo. So this one kind of shows he's fighting the turtle monster. He flies off and grabs a big chunk of glacier from a mountain, and he kind of psychs out the turtle that, oh, winter must be coming on early, and he tricks him into digging in the mud and hibernating. So that's something that could have happened in between fighting that monster, between issue 1 and 2. So that's kind of fun to do. Scenes that we never saw. This is the cover of the second issue. I used to do a lot of superhero parodies with the Justice Louts, and this is going to be inserted graphically, but I came up with this insane org chart of, how superhero continuity is always so confusing, of who left what group and who died and who was reborn and who got rebooted. So there's just going to be this insane flow chart of all these, like a corporate org chart. And he doesn't get any of it. So it's been fun.
So how are you, when we were talking, how are you approaching the art? It's really cool. Some people have completely and utterly moved away from all physical art.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit how you're approaching this new Ultra Klutz?
Yeah, I think you can see from these aren't the best examples, but so I made a font out of my lettering from the Ultra Klutz of the era. So it's going to have my old lettering. I picked the best. I wasn't a good letterer, but I was able to pick the best examples and convert them into a font. So that's saving a lot of time. I used to do border tape, and then later I did, a thicker pen and painstakingly fatten up those borders. I'm doing that digitally now. I'm doing tones. Whenever Kenji and Sam shared this zone, there was always some screen tones in there. I digitized some of those from old comics, and I'm dropping those in digitally. What else? And then I can adjust things too, like if this bottom panel, when I first drew it, so I start in blue pencil, and if I drew this and I just love the composition, but it was all like over this much, I would just ink it there and scoot it over digitally later instead of having to God dang it, and erase and reposition it. So I use the classic Winsor Newton Series 7 number 2 brush, which when I stopped buying them, they were up to about $20 a piece. And I went to a college art store to buy a couple, and they rang them up at $2. And I said, "What? Is that right?" "Oh yeah, they're $2." So I bought 20 of them. Bought 20 friggin' Winsor Newtons back in 1997 for $2 a piece. I'm still going with those.
You cannot beat that, man. Those are the weapons of the gods.
Yeah, and the quality was lessening over the years too. So it was getting harder and harder to even pick out a good one in the store. So that was a lifesaver. And then I used to use Rapidograph, and now I'm using a Micron pen for the hatching. Like in later years, Ultra Klutz's stripes were just solid black for contrast, but I used to do all that, line work, like here, wrapping around his shoulders and stuff. And I'm doing that again because I want it to look like 1986.
You used to do that in Rapidograph?
Yeah.
That is, oh my gosh, that had to have been a chore.
Yeah. I guess I really dug it because those old ones are, I'm not going quite to the level of those old ones because they were just insane. You look at the shading under us, I'm backwards. The shading under this character, it's just
yeah,
hatch over hatch over hatch over hatch.
So none of that is screen tone. That's all just you.
There's some screen tone on this space or the sky here, but
No, that is absolutely incredible,
That's
man.
all. That's all hatching. All the
Wow.
clothing. Yeah. I was going like 4 or 5 directions with hatching, and
I sorry, that is incredibly impressive. I assumed there was more use of like a zip tone or something like that going on when I was reading those. Wow.
later, yeah, Lost Laughter had a lot of screen tones because I was mostly doing everything with the brush.
Ah, okay.
So kind of reverting back to that heavy hatching just to make it look vintage. There's a video. I don't know if you've seen the video on my channel where I'm actually drawing like issue number 5 and
No.
shake it, clack, 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 the rapidograph and just doing that. You can hear the VCR camera buzzing, that whine. Like a friend of mine made a video called Small Press Comic when I was doing the zines. So it just captured that moment in late 1985 before I did the distributed one.
Oh, that's amazing. I don't know how I missed that.
Yeah, it's
For
called.
anybody watching this, there will be a link in the description
Oh,
below.
oh, thank you. Yeah, it's fun. It's old video, but this guy was a film hound, and he wanted to get into making documentaries, and so I think it's only 6 or 7 minutes, if that, and it shows this cheapskate little hovel I used to live in and make the comics, and I had a old photocopier in the closet.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the one question that I did kind of forget about. No Regrets showed
Mm,
up in Negative Burn as well,
yep,
correct?
yep,
And No
yep.
Regrets was kind of the original version of the Vertigo story.
It's the kill fee story. Yeah, they approached me. It was funny. They were really gaming us, which is fine. That's what they do. But they they called me and said, "We want you to be in the first issue of The Dreaming." And I think in hindsight, they called all kinds of indie artists and said the same thing: to get everybody working, get everybody excited, and then pick their favorite one. So it became apparent after a while I wasn't doing the first one, but originally they were saying, you're going to do the first one and you're going to do a multi-story arc and blah blah blah. So that was the No Regrets. Was going to have Cain and Abel as a framing device, and I don't think it was going to have any of the Endless in it because I wasn't even into those comics, to be honest. um, and so it's mostly the same story, and I did rewrites, and it was a weird experience because like you would they would have you give your revisions or your rewrites and all this stuff over the phone. It seems so old school. It seems almost like an advertising agency. Like, give me the pitch, Darren Stevens. Like you couldn't just send them a typewritten thing and have them read it and make a decision. It's like, give me the pitch on the phone. That was their style. Found it very weird. I had to prep myself and get ready to read this little pitch. And they changed it a few times, and then they just out of the blue they said, we want you to do a one shot with Mervyn Pumpkinhead instead, and we want you to draw it, because the other one was just going to be me writing these multi-issue arc, all just completely bizarre to me. Is it probably either actually I think it was because I watched a video with Steve Bissett, and I think they mined him when they were starting Vertigo because he got off, was doing Taboo. It was kind of a reverse, like they came to him and his Kubert School contemporaries for Vertigo, but then later when he was doing his thing and had left, they kind of came to him like, hey, who's out there in this indie world that we can tap? So I don't know, but he may have told them, hey, how about Jeff Nicholson? He did the Habitrails. So that could be the genesis of that. So that was the No Regret story. And and then I did the Mervyn Pumpkinhead one shot. And at the time, I felt like I always had to be drawing. So even though that story was killed, it's like, well, I'm just going to draw it for myself just to stay limber, because that's where I was at that time, always trying to work something. And I knew Joe Pruitt at Caliber and sent them those send him one chapter. He says, yeah, we'll run it. We'll do the whole thing. Keep it coming. So, and they paid. It was all good.
I'm a big fan of Negative Burn. It's one of those series that I kind of caught on to as a kid. It was one of the few like you know anthology series where I would read it and I was like, wow, this actually has some really interesting stuff that would make me pick up the next issue.
It did.
What was Caliber like? I know nothing about that company, and it's very difficult to find like hardcore reliable information about them out there.
I've got a great story. There's so many. There's just so many stories like this that just knock you up and down when in comics. So I was approached by Gary Reed. I think he's the late Gary Reed now. He was a really nice guy. He wanted to do Father and Son after Kitchen Sink was done with it. And do you remember a cheesy mail order company called American Entertainment?
Oh yeah.
They put out these catalogs and they're all this kind of hustle. This one's sure to be a speculator's bonanza. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
So they hooked up with Gary Reed, poor guy, and they wanted to start buying properties to exploit them for media, kind of like Icebox did with cartoons in the same time period, mid 90s, probably trying to, ape the Max and the Liquid Television. And American Entertainment wanted to get in there and have the next big thing and probably do all the variant covers but own the media rights. So they wanted to work with Caliber and me to do a monthly father and son comic, which just blew my mind, like, what? And so that was back when you could just trick me into rolling up my sleeves and getting busy. And I started drawing father and son again. And this was around the time of before Colonia, but it was when I was really getting into using more reference, and I really got into it, and I did some really nice work. And it was supposed to be $1,000 an issue, that's okay. That's about $50 a page. And I said, but I've got to have the money on completion of the art. And for me, that meant when I send you the photocopies, because I was smart enough by then. I'm not mailing you, not FedEx you a bunch of art, and you're going to tell me you're going to pay me later. So, but they totally wanted to exploit the characters in some way. And I did 2 issues. And I guess what finally happened was maybe they talked to some entertainment lawyers, and someone told the goofball at American Entertainment, it's like, it's bad enough having a media deal with a publisher and a creator fighting over it, like an Image and a Sam Keith or whatever. But now you introduce a third party. You've got artist and publisher and impresario behind the curtain. Now you got 3 entities with a copyright, and now you want to make a show. It's like, it's not going to happen. So that conversation must have just blew it up for them, and they didn't even tell me it was done. It just ceased to be a thing. Fortunately, I never sent any actual original art, and just kind of ended in a whimper. But that's very typical of the kind of things that you can get involved in. And I've been through so many of those. So ended up publishing that myself as a father and son special with all the leftover Caliber.
I was going to ask what happened to that, man. I was like, God, did you let that just lie or do something with it?
Yeah, let me grab it. We're talking about ganging up comics. I had done the Ultra Klutz Dreams for Tundra, had enough for an issue. And then I had done the Father and Son. I kind of revived the characters. I kind of almost getting kind of loving rockets with them. And had this big fat 48-page issue. And I ganged them up, printed them both, and they both sold about 1,200 copies, which was enough to make a little money and enough to carry on with it. So kind of got them out of my system, quit having dreams about them. But I guess that's another reason I'm going digital, even though I love print. I've got bookcases full of print, and I'm having fun drawing again. But just to even think about soliciting with Diamond and going to, getting a quote from a printer and having Diamond even possibly say, sorry, because I have a friend that's one of my peers. He's my age, and he's been publishing a little bit longer than me. And it blew him off and said, "We're not going to list one of your books." And he's been publishing for decades. And maybe it's all fair. And maybe with COVID and with so many factors that it's confusing now. My local retailer said he didn't order any copies of one of my books that another publisher tried to publish because he knew that publisher always crowdfunds everything. And so he's like, well, he's going to crowdfund it all and have all of his customers pre-sold. So another reason it would be confusing for a retailer, just all the dynamics are so different now. And I just kind of don't want to play anymore. I want to draw. I'm really good at digital processing. I enjoy that. I've digitized my entire back catalog, which is, well over 1,000 pages. I don't know if it's 1,300 pages that I've done in my career, all been remastered on Comixology. And I just don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. I don't have to have closets full of stuff. And shipping has gotten super expensive. I mean, international media mail went away, so you can't ship anything overseas. And even Canada cost a fortune. And even media mail, the lowest thing you can go to send one comic book to one person is going to be $3.40 plus the supplies. So
can you talk a little bit about how you've seen because I know you've taken breaks, but how have you seen the dynamic shift as things have gone digitally? Because I think for a lot of people, they are like me. They're going to miss the paper products. I think those are going kind of the way of the dinosaur, outside of maybe the crowdsourcing stuff that you talked about, where you have your built-in audience and they're paying up front. But I think it also does really free up people like yourself who simply want to create now and don't necessarily want to have to be tied down with all the ancillary responsibilities that you had to take on as a younger man.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a more of a positive thing, or are you like me, going to miss your paper products?
I think I'm not going to miss them, but that probably wouldn't have been true even 2 years ago. I've never been interested in digital comics, and it was only because the father and son omnibus flopped. It didn't get published, and I was left with an entire package I had done for pre-press, and I didn't want to, for all those reasons, go back to publishing. And I even thought about print on demand, and for some reason, like you said, that additional level of responsibility, I just don't want to. You're going to have to partner with Amazon or partner with, there's all these other, I forget the names, and they're going to take a cut. They're going to take a big chunk of the money, and then there's going to be those exorbitant shipping fees for each individual copy. And it's doable. It gives people that print, which would be nice, and then I could have my little copy for myself. But it's such a big hurdle to do, just because we don't want to let go of the print. And I think what's helped me is that in other media, I finally let go. Like music, I was hardcore about the physical. Even with CDs, I just love having everything on the shelf and tactile, and the booklets and the art. And it was really hard for me to let go of even like burning CDs, because I loved having this thing. I used to make my own stickers. I had binders and binders full of homemade CDs, which were like the stepchildren of the old cassette mixtapes. And I finally went with digital music, and now I'm just all digital music, and I don't think about it. I've discovered new music, and it's like I'm not thinking anything about anything other than the song. And so I hope people can just click a button, pay $2.99 for a comic, and just dig it. And it's like, it could be print, could be better, could be tactile, but I could also not be doing it. So this is what it is, what it is, right? This is the flavor it comes in now. So I hope everybody can get behind it.
Oh, I definitely will be checking it out, and I have more than a little bit of a distaste for digital comics, so
Yeah,
I think there'll be an audience out there for it.
yeah,
But depending on people's reaction, depending on the sales that you see from it, and if you did have the opportunity to collect stuff, not necessarily
yeah.
do floppies again, because I
Right.
see floppies are just they are truly going the way of the dinosaur. Trades,
Yeah.
though, I think still probably do have a pretty good life left. Have you given any thought to, maybe if things go well and I had somebody who was willing to put something concrete in
Right.
front of me, that you would do something as far as physical collected work?
Oh yeah, I definitely. It would have to be the right person, someone I could trust. I don't want to sound like a prima donna, but just you've heard those stories now, so you don't want to get involved with someone who's just going to list it with diamond and not do anything else and drop the ball, because it would have to be an investment. Someone would have to publish it knowing that they're going to have it's going to have to be in their closet or their business's closet for 10 years. You don't want it to sell out tomorrow. You want it to. So if someone did a volume of this, if I did 8 or 10 issues and they wanted to do a big collection, I would have to trust that they know they're wanting to keep that available to retailers over the course of many years and hope they don't sell out. Because you don't want that either when you're a publisher, because then you're burdened with another run.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the thing that comes to mind, like I was clueless about IDW. Like I only learned about them a couple of years ago, and it's like on the Wikipedia, it's like they're the third largest publisher. I guess they're bigger than Dark Horse. And like, who is this? I've been so hibernating, and then I saw a picture of Chris Staros, a guy I used to know, and from what I read, it was a convention picture. It sounded like it was saying he was of IEW. I don't know if he's an editor or part of that or founded that company. I don't know anything about it. But as an example, if someone like Chris Staros, a guy that I knew, and some company that had it going on really wanted to publish something in print and they wanted to take care of it, it's like, heck yeah. It's just not something I would want to go like chasing or sending out a bunch of proposals to everybody and praying someone answered. It's just
Oh
like,
yeah.
that's kind of where I'm at it.
That's just interesting you brought up IDW, because that's exactly who I was thinking of. They've done some incredible collections, and they got a couple of small imprints and stuff. They're handling Sam Keith's Max now.
Is that right?
Yeah, Sam actually, you took time off, so you probably don't know. Colorist wonderkind Steve Oliff was the guy who originally did all of this stuff for the Max, and he used to show it to Sam, I guess, on light boxes. Yeah, his original art, and Sam would just flip out, and he was so crazy about it. And then it would see print, and Sam would like be on the verge of tears. He said, "What happened to the fucking colors? The saturation is gone, and all of the and his printing and all of this and all of that." So he went back recently, and I don't remember who they did it with. I have to admit, I prefer the original color palette because it's kind of what I grew up on, and I think everything else is a bit of a shock. But it's called the Max Maximized, and they put out floppies of all 35 issues, completely remastered, completely recolored. Then they followed that up with the Max Maxed Out, which were massive omnibus-style trade paperbacks. Followed that up with hardcover limited editions. Followed that up with even more slipcased hardcover editions, and then collected the original art from all of the, I think, first 6 issues into an artist's edition Max book.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, IDW is kind of like one of the companies that I look to in the future to be the benchmark setters.
Yeah.
They're starting to get love for their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series, it is great, man. The way they handle their properties is absolutely amazing. So I was curious, if you would toy around playing with somebody like that.
I was so unaware of them, but I did get the just a couple months ago. I got the Cerebus Treasury of Cover Art.
Oh yeah.
IDW book. It's gorgeous. It's a thing of beauty.
Their eye for detail is absolutely amazing, and it's something that I think has been missing in comics for a long time. Sorry, let me look at my notes really quick here to make
Mhm.
sure I didn't miss anything. No, I think I have about grilled you on all of my notes here. Is there anything that I missed that you'd like to bring up or talk about?
Nope, I just want to put on my hat.
So cowboy. Um, but you got your approval on getting Comixology did accept the first issue.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, it's the story arc is called Ultra Klutz 1986, just so people will know it's kind of a retro thing, because now I think with Wonder Woman 1984, people are going to probably pick up on that kind of the idea, and that it's in the past. It's new stuff that's in the past. And the first new issue is number 32, so it picks up where the old one left off just for fun. It's like I don't need the hype of a new number one, so I would rather, see myself get to an issue 40 than have yet another new number one. So that's the reason for that. So yeah, so number 32, I just got the acceptance. Usually you get a follow-up email in about a week with the release date. They're usually on a Wednesday. All of mine have been. And so I'm hoping about the middle of April is when it's going to come out.
Most excellent. And anybody who's watching this, keep an eye on the channel. As soon as that comes out, I will be putting up a post and I'll update this, and there will be links in the description below so you guys can pick up all of that. And while I'm thinking about it, because all of your stuff is on Comixology, there will be a link to all of that in the description below. I cannot recommend that you guys check out some of his stuff. For me personally, Through the Habit Trails is probably the thing that's hit me hardest. I have fallen in love with most, but I can tell you, you will enjoy all of it. I just really want to thank you for taking so much time humoring me with all of my silly questions. I cannot tell you how much I've enjoyed your work over the years. I am so looking forward to the new Ultra Klutz coming out. And while I hope you're not pushing yourself too hard, I do keep my fingers crossed that maybe this lets you move into digital and do some more stuff that maybe just kind of comes to you in your dreams as an unfinished comic beyond Ultra Klutz too, man.
Could happen.
So,
old dog's learning some new tricks.
Hey, man. I hope so. Otherwise, I am doomed to walking in circles. All right, man. Well, thanks so much for being on the channel with me and humoring all my silly questions. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great night, man.
All right. I had a blast. Thank you, sir.